Hey everybody, welcome back for another week. As soon as this comes up here, we can get caught up to where we were. But this is the second half of what happens when FDR took over as president in 1933. Um, right when the Great Depression is really getting underway. So this is where we left off. And there were a number of programs coming out for his New Deal program that were designed to essentially get America back on its feet. But we're going to look a little bit more at detailed stuff today that starts off with stuff going on in the agriculture industry. Obviously, in the 1930s, there was there were a lot more people who were involved in the agriculture industry than today. Obviously, today we have a much more urban society. 30% of the labor force overall was working in farming then. I don't know what it is now, but it's significantly less. But one of the problems, of course, is that farmers had taken out a lot of loans during the late part of World War I, early 1920s, bought more land, and they were obviously still making payments on that land, or they were doing the same for things like tractors, large pieces of equipment that they couldn't pay for in cash they had on hand. So when the Depression occurs, people are buying less, and you have people, for instance, because prohibition's going on. There's less food products from the farm that are being used to make things like beer. The farmers, of course, don't do very well. They're going to be operating at a net loss a lot of the time. And as a result, they can't make their payments. Banks swoop in. They say, all right, we're going to take your farm away for non-payment. After months and months and months of not getting paid, the banks are doing anything they can to try and stay solvent. And they're thinking they could take the farm back and potentially auction it and make some money that way and maybe have the new buyer, pay them, obviously. And the farmers didn't like this very much. They really didn't like it very much, of course. And there were some programs that were created in various places, like in the Midwest, where they had things like the Farmer Holiday Association. And these, were essentially groups of farmers who organized together. And they said, we want some help. And some of the things they did, let's say there's an auction that's going to be taking place for a farm or the assets for a particular farm. Bank said you have to move out, and all these local people gather together, for the auction of said farm on, let's say, a Saturday. Well, all these people would get together and put a whole bunch of other farmers would show up, and they'd be really ticked off thinking they were either the next ones or something else. And then they would start the bidding, and, they might, for instance, use violence, literally like bring guns, or not saying people were shot or killed or anything, but they definitely intimidated other people from making any significant offers. And sometimes, what they could do is they would say, all right, the auction's going to start off at, $100 for this farm. Again, remember, money is worth more than. And an individual might say, I bid 10 cents, and nobody else would say anything else because everybody's standing around glaring with guns. And, ultimately, the bank is going to be forced to sell the farm at a tremendous loss because they don't get any other bids. And then, the guy who made the bid turns around to his next door neighbor, a friend of his for 20 years, and says, here's your farm back. They spent $1 on it. Pay them back when you can or something. And this was happening in the banks, of course, were, absolutely outraged by this because it completely circumvents their ability to get repaid for a loan they put out. But there's not a lot they can do because FDR, as a Democrat, has, a lot of ties to the agriculture industry. They helped him get elected in 1932. The banks are more in line with the Republicans, who lost hard in 1932. And there's not a lot of sympathy. One thing that FDR is going to do as a specific program to try and help out the farmers is something known as the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA. If everybody produces as much as they possibly could, law of supply and demand says the more of something there is, the lower the price is going to be. So the idea was to artificially limit how much of something was being produced. Let's say it's rice. If you have 100% of all farm areas producing rice, there's going to be so much produced that the cost of it's going to be quite low. So what they want to do is twofold. One, they're going to try and encourage people to grow a little bit less, which is going to decrease supply and then increase the price. But at the same time, a farm field that is going to lie fallow, as it's known, which basically means that a part of the farmer's crop area is not going to be planted that particular year, it allows the soil to recover. This was one of the things that obviously caused the South to have problems because they didn't do this enough prior to the Civil War. But when the government passes this program, they do it partway through a growing year. And, a farmer being, or looking at the situation where he's not going to make a lot of money says, wait a minute, I can get paid by the government for not growing stuff, for not going out and tending this part of my field. And because it's partway through the growing year, they literally go out and destroy part of their crops. If you're like a livestock farmer, you kill some of your cattle, they kill some of you kill some of your cattle, you kill some of your hogs or whatever. And as you can see, from the part that's kind of covered up by my face, 10 million acres of cotton is plowed under instead of being used for something effective. They go out and they kill 6 million piglets before they can even grow up, because again, the government's going to encourage farmers not to grow as much as possible. It's seen as a necessary thing to prop up farmers, but it's also like, when people are hungry, the idea that all this food's going to go to waste, that they're going to literally just, the green bean crop is coming in and they're going to, destroy a good chunk of it. Well, it's seen as wasteful by a lot of people. And, a lot of people are like, I can't believe this is the government's reaction to things, is to decrease the amount of food available to starving people. So, in the first year that comes out, that's not really such a great idea because of the timing on it. If they'd done it in the winter before people had planted, wouldn't have had as much controversy. But in 1934 and onwards, people were able to plan for it. It's still a program that's used today, albeit in a different form. I remember growing up for a few years in North Dakota, and there were some farms there that, were just kind of let go for, a year. And you can see that in operation all around us. Another thing this also did was it kept the prices a little bit higher than supply and demand would normally dictate, which was, also criticized by some. But another problem for this is that individuals like sharecroppers, individuals, if you recall, after the Civil War, who couldn't buy their own farm, basically rented it from somebody and said, we'll give you a large percentage of what is grown in the field over the course of the year as a form of payment. And, these individuals are out there essentially renting the land. Well, now the government will pay the owner of the land to not have everything farmed. And of course, the sharecropper is dependent upon growing as much as possible, selling as much as possible, and also then paying back the owner of the land. Well, owners of the land said, I don't care if you're going to pay me off, and whatever you're going to give me, they got paid by the government. So in some cases, they literally kicked some of these sharecroppers to the curb and said, I'm going to get paid no matter what. Why don't you get out of here? And for a lot of sharecroppers, this represented a distinct challenge to their economic success, because now they didn't have a livelihood. And where are they going to try to go for cities or go for work? Cities, obviously. And unfortunately, there's a lot of unemployment in the cities because factories have closed down because, again, consumption and individual spending power is down. So this seems like, a thing with something that's never going to work. Now, to give you an idea, farmers did make a little bit more money because, again, you saw examples like here's the cotton crop going from 6.5 to 10 cents in 1933, just simply because the supply was going to be cut down. Farm income did go up. But, how was this all paid for? Where's this extra money coming from that's going to pay farmers not to farm things? Well, it's through taxes on food producers. So today we would call that like Del Monte or other things. They don't grow the food themselves. They buy it from people. But there are going to be taxes placed on them. And later on, because of the way this is constructed, it'll be one of many things that the Supreme Court is going to declare unconstitutional about the New Deal, as you'll see in the next presentation. We'll get through that. So overall, there were some real criticisms of the AAA, and some people said, nah, it really doesn't work very well. Oops, I guess that's not going to play. All right. Another program that the Roosevelt administration is going to come up with is known as the TVA. It's still around today. If you see in the map area here, the shaded area represents the valley, the basin that's created by the Tennessee River. It was a very, very poor, impoverished area. And as a result of that, very, very, expensive to run electricity into the area. It's very backwoodsy, rural, really, really economically behind. And this was a major area that had not yet gotten electricity, which of course is helpful for things like hospitals or just a decent quality of life and so forth. And you can see there's a number of cities or a number of states over there on the left-hand side that, would benefit from this. So the federal government took it upon itself to do something that would do two different things. One, they decided to build a series of dams that are going to then therefore be used to create hydroelectric power, generating electricity to electrify the area shown, shaded there. So it's going to give people work, which is also going to be significant because it's a very impoverished area. And again, there are a lot of farmers and they're getting paid now not to farm things. And you might think, well, they're making money, but they're very hard scrabble, poor individuals, and anything's going to look better. If you got multiple sons, you can't leave multiple sons or daughters even, one farm and have it divided among, say, 5 kids. So this is going to give people some serious good paying jobs to bring electricity to an area that badly needs it, which again might spur some people to buying their first radio or washing machine or something else. So this is going to be a major project, and it does create dams along the Tennessee Valley area. It will have a major spillover effect in World War II, which we'll talk about next year. There's another program called the Civil Works Administration, CWA. And in this case, the Civil Works Administration is going to, again, provide work for people. Civil works are things, basically, they're smallish jobs. It's not seen as a long-term fix. And you can see some of the examples that are up here. They're not skilled workers typically. But you do see unskilled workers. And this is somebody who doesn't have a lot of formal training in a job. So, somebody who's hired at Publix typically is an unskilled worker. Somebody is going to be a bagger or a checkout person or a store stock person. Sorry, you might think that's, a really, really, awesome skill, but a skill would be somebody like, a carpenter or an electrician, or where there's a licensing exam and there's things like that. That people have to be really qualified at what they do. So they're going to do a lot of things to give people jobs. It's the federal government creating jobs to just get money in people's hands, basically. And there's this term you see in the upper right, the boondoggles, which a lot of people are going to say is going on because they're just wasting government money. Not every job was a boondoggle, but please don't get that idea. But again, the history of the safety pin. How do you study the history of the safety pin? I'd really like to know how you do that. It seems like a complete waste of time and money. Pigeons were, of course, pooping on like statues and things like that. And some of these statues, are not reacting well to the chemicals in the poop and whatnot. And they wanted to keep the pigeons away. And they thought it would be cheaper to have people walk around balloons that scared, the pigeons away rather than and have them just perch on top of General Grant and do their business all over his horse, which has to be cleaned and, whatever. But the issue there was it was designed specifically to give people some kind of work. It's a make work program. And that's a term. Notice what I said there, make work. The make work programs, there's several of them that will come out that the government seems to be creating jobs just for the purpose of giving people jobs and money. And this is a really good example of that. The Public Works Administration, this one's a little bit more heavy duty. Public works are things that are done on behalf of the public. And that might seem really, really obvious. But that a lot of government projects like, sewer systems, roadways, all kinds of things like that. If a city, county, state decides to work on a project that is building something for the betterment of the public, that's typically a public work. It's known as the PWA. This one is a more long-term thing. And again, individual companies are going to be contracted by the government to use skilled labor to come in and do this. A lot of architects, a lot of surveyors, a lot of people who are very, very, competent with doing a lot of like construction and building. So they do a lot of projects across the country, and you can see examples. Some of these you might be aware of, like the 100-mile bridge, the whole system of bridges between Key West and the regular part of Florida. A lot of that was done, at least for the first time, by the Roosevelt administration. In some cases, it didn't get replaced until very, very, very recently, which is always awesome when you have salt water, around a steel bridge. That's a really good plan. Withstands as many hurricanes as they do, and they still are going to use them. A lot of the schools built between 1933 and 39 were built specifically by this PWA in an effort to make sure that there were enough to go around. A lot of local schools had to close, so they kind of created more regional schools in places like the Midwest. And this gave them, solid buildings to work out of. Some of them are still on the National Historic Register today. Sewage plants and airports, what is now known as LaGuardia Airport today. It wasn't known as that then. The mayor of New York at the time was Fiorello LaGuardia. But that particular project was a PWA project. Grand Coulee Dam, Bonneville Dam, and Boulder Dam, which later became known as Hoover Dam, named after, of course, the recent president, are all examples of massive projects that were done by the federal government that gave an awful lot of people work to do really, really solid things that happened to have stood, the test of time. So the PWA was a big deal. The PWA saw 34,000 projects built. A lot of them are roads. Again, a lot of the roads that existed before that were dirt roads. Now, of course, they're going to have paved roads. And, for every project that the PWA created, there was a spillover effect in the sense that, let's say you're going to build a road. Well, you need to get asphalt from somebody, and you need to get like road clearing machines or road graders that are going to flatten out the surface and things like that. So for every person who was employed directly by a project, they needed supplies, equipment, or materials that came from about 2 other people, which is an example in economics terms of a multiplier effect. How you're not just spending money on that project, it's going to be diffused throughout the economy. And then like the guy who makes the asphalt is going to be able to go to Publix and buy his food and so forth and so on. A lot of the concrete, a lot of the steel used by the country during this time frame is going to go into PWA projects. Now, something that was done to try and it's called level the playing field was another FDR program in the New Deal called the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA. This is not the same thing as the National Rifle Association, if you're familiar with that lobbying organization. But this tried to make sure as many people as possible were working in a given industry. So let's say in our case, let's say Malik has a shoe factory and Josh has a shoe factory. They're in the same town. Malik wants to be number one, so he offers, let's say, for instance, a dime more an hour than Josh is going to offer. Well, a lot of people are going to want to go work for Malik, and potentially a lot of the workers at Josh's place are going to say, that's it, we're out of here, and go over to Malik's place. Well, that's going to make it difficult for Josh to put out shoes, and he might have to go out of business, and then that would lead to other people being out of work, and that would be a problem. So what they did was they said, in the same kind of industry, we're not going to allow people to do things that are too radically different than the other. You're going to have the same number of shifts. You're going to pay the same wages. And basically, it's looking to make sure that everybody who wants and needs a job in a particular sector is going to have a chance to do that. So, there's not as much competition to poach each other's workers or to be more attractive as a place to work. It does infringe on, essentially a businessman's ability to decide what works best for him. But in the long run, this made sure more people were working. So, instead of saying, more people have to work harder to get more money at this particular plant, everybody's going to work and everything else. And maybe both shoe factories are going to go to 3 shifts a day to handle the work that's out there. Instead of paying people a lot more to crank out more in their shift, it's still going to make sure that the maximum number of people are working and bringing in an income. So, for example, the cotton textile code was used as an example here for the 40-hour week. No one who's a child under the age of 16 is allowed to work. Now, previous to this, they were. And you might think they weren't, but now this is a federal law, and it's going to be something that's going to be enforced. Obviously, there's somewhat of an incentive for people to inform on somebody who's violating the rules. There's a minimum wage of $12. And people are allowed to join unions, which are going to fight for their ability to both work as well as have decent working conditions. And they're also going to, pardon me a moment, they're going to be allowed to, with their unions, collectively bargain, which means instead of like me coming in saying I should get paid more as a history teacher because I put on honor flight, doesn't fly. It's like all teachers with the same experience and everything else will get the same salary. Doesn't matter if they do, a great job, a poor job, but they bargain as a unit. And it does make it easier for management in the sense they don't have to figure out, in the case of Suncoast, 100 and some odd salary positions. They only have to, go by a set guideline. But they're not paying somebody because, last year your students passed this test with this percentage and you put on honor flight and, you took students to, the Holocaust Museum or whatever. It doesn't, that doesn't come into play. So the New Deal is part of the first Roosevelt administration, aka 33 to 37. There's going to be a presidential election in 1936 to decide whether or not FDR gets another 4 years. As you probably know, he gets elected for another 4 years. And the first New Deal was kind of an immediate thing to deal with the immediate situation that's going on. Some of the things are going to get overturned by the Supreme Court and so forth. But during the course of the second New Deal is going to be much, much, much more long-term in nature. And as a result of that, that begins to look at the systemic problems that caused the Great Depression to occur instead of just being a Band-Aid to solve what was, the temporary condition at the time. So here's exactly what I just said, basically. Some of the things weren't fixing the systemic issues. The New Deal had seen some issues overturned by the Supreme Court. And this is, again, going to be 35 to 38. It's going to involve the government spending a lot more money they didn't have than they actually were bringing in. And it's going to be a little bit of a change. So, sorry. I know we had the CWA, we had the PWA, and now we have the WPA, which is the Works Progress Administration. This program is going to last a while. It's going to be similar to the PWA. You see a lot of buildings, bridges, and roads are going to be built, but they also have other programs that begin capturing other types of work within the economy that kind of got overlooked before. A lot of the WPA people are unskilled workers, doesn't require as much training, and you can hire a lot more people. Sorry, I told you before the PWA built LaGuardia, it's WPA. But example, there are some people with some real talents out there for writing. John Steinbeck being one, not a lot of people have the extra money at that point to go out and start buying books at their local bookstore. However, the government's going to hire people to go out and write travel books, or why should I go visit Carlsbad Caverns? What's so great about the Grand Canyon? Tell me about Yosemite and the history of the people who used to live there. So, these guys aren't getting a lot of pay for what they're producing at the time. And as a result, obviously, they're not doing well. So the WPA is going to hire writers to go out there and travel around and do things like travel books. If you're an artist into painting, well, there are new buildings being built, a lot of post offices, a lot of schools. In fact, there was a critical news story at the end of 2019 about a school in California that had this Depression era piece of artwork that, was quite well known by somebody who was pretty well famous. And unfortunately, there's no easy way to remove it without destroying it. But it wasn't seen as politically correct today. And so the school board has voted to basically, paint over it and, just, completely obliterate it. But, artists weren't having a whole lot of people who were out there, saying, oh, paint me, something to look at. So in order to beautify these new public buildings, sculptors, got commissions to do some sculpting. Painters got some commissions to do that as well. Actors went around the country and tried to lift the spirits of the people by putting on shows. And this is, again, part of what the WPA did to increase the employment of people in different fields that previously had been overlooked. So Thomas Hart Benton, I happen to think he's a pretty solid guy. John Brown, of course, the guy who was in the Potawatomi Massacre and then later on tried to go after the Harper's Ferry Arsenal. You can see here's John Brown, inspired by God, supposedly, and you can see different things going on. Here's a tornado and a fire. This is life on the prairie, essentially. And you see, these individuals coming off for the Union, these individuals coming off for, the Confederacy and what it was all leading towards. You can see people who are fallen, facing towards each other. Benton does a lot of artwork like this that are seen in a lot of places around the United States. Dorothea Lange becomes a very well-known photographer, and you'll hear more about her later on. And they pay photographers to go around the country and essentially document this really unusual time in American history. You got to remember, it's not like today where everybody has a smartphone with a camera and you can take all the pictures you want of life at home during the coronavirus. Instead, they go around because nothing like this has ever been seen before, and it may never be seen again. And they want to document for future generations what life looked like during what was known as Great Depression. So here's a family, who's out there living. You can see this is just like, it looks like a dress, but might be all that person has to wear. Nobody's wearing shoes. They're wearing a clapboard style house over here. You can see the dirt roads over here in this area. A farmer, the Dust Bowl, they are the reason we know what it looks like during the Great Depression more than anything else, because they were hired to go out and take pictures. And again, pictures were very rare and pictures were very expensive to develop. And they made it possible for us to know what things were looking like. A group of people who were essentially hobos, hopping on freight cars and moving different parts of the country. Again, this could be the Okies and the Arkies heading to California. But it gives you an idea of what was going on. This, of course, being, a further outshot than the more famous Migrant Mother, which is zoomed in on, this mom as she's staring out into the nothingness. In an effort to pay for things and raise money, the rich were seen as a target by the Roosevelt administration. Now, again, Roosevelt's a rich guy, but he is going to say, you know what, people were making crazy amounts of money. I mean, let's look at it realistically. Does Kanye West really, need that much money he earns in a year to live on? Probably not. So they're going to increase the tax rates on those people who are really, really wealthy and begin, essentially a higher tax bracket to start paying for things. But it's not going to be enough to pay for everything. I mean, let's be honest. The government's going to go into massive debt during the Great Depression paying for all these programs. You can see, those earning $16,000 a year only paid $1,000 in taxes. It's not quite a 10% rate, but it's more than 5%. And that's certainly not what I'm paying right now. I'm more like 27%. But overall, anybody making more than $50,000 a year could pay as much as 75% of their income back to the government, which you got to admit, if you're going to be paying 75% of your salary to the government, you might not be as encouraged to work as hard. And that's what some people argued as well. It only raised $250 million. And I'm going to tell you right now, that wasn't enough to cover all these programs the federal government's doing to give people work. Another major thing that comes out in the second New Deal is the Wagner Labor Relations Act. This is going to expand, the ability of people to join a union. A lot of people, in management and owners of businesses, of course, don't like unions because unions want to go on strike or they want to ask for things or demand things that, the owner might not want to do because it's going to cost them more money or take away some of their profits. So the Wagner National Labor Relations Act, allowed people to join unions if they wanted to. It does require a vote of people in a workplace. A certain percentage has to reach. And if you want to retaliate against people who join a union, that's also illegal. It's still, this is the law in the United States today. Amazon, for instance, has faced this. Walmart has faced this at times, and it's the legal basis for people working there to say, we'd like to form a union because we feel, maybe we're being exploited or something else isn't safe. And like I said, this during the area of the Great Depression, when people could be taken advantage of, oh, you want to work? Well, you have to, live with, conditions that are 150 degrees every single day inside this factory, or there's no breaks, or you're not allowed to stop to have lunch, or there's no bathroom breaks, or, basically, this is going to expand people's rights to have a union advocating on their behalf. Another major program that comes around that still is in action today, of course, is the Social Security Act, Florida's lifeline. Obviously, let's say, for instance, if in a time of, not a lot of jobs, you have an older worker who is not wanting to give up his job because he's, got an income. Well, what about a younger guy? In your case, in a few years, you're going to graduate from college and you want to go out and get a job. But if that old experienced person is there and they don't want to give up their job, you might not be able to get one. So this was started as, and it's important to know this, it was started as a supplemental insurance program. The idea was that people would receive their pay every week, every month, every, whatever, and they would take some of that out and invest that for their future. It was not intended, and I'm still saying, important to note for today, Social Security was never intended to be the sole form of income for people who are older. Now, for the most part, that's what a lot of older people are depending on. Pensions, and what people tend to spend more, of their money today than they did back then. People were putting their money away for a rainy day, like coronavirus hunkering down. People were putting away money for, medical disasters or other things. And they're also putting away money towards retirement. which unfortunately, explains some of the stock market crash. But the Social Security Act got older people to say, we're going to provide like this safety net for you. When you're older, you're going to get paid. So you don't have to continue working. That gave younger workers the ability to come in. Now, just put it out there, the way that school districts operate, for example, a brand new teacher is going to cost a lot less because, you pay more for years of experience. But a new teacher is going to cost a lot less than a teacher who's been around for 35 years. So this is going to actually cause businesses or public government entities to save some money by having these folks go, all right, I can afford to retire. I'm going to get money from the federal government. At the time, farm laborers and domestic servants aren't going to be included because they were paid privately. Now, of course, if they're paid and their money is tracked by the IRS, they're going to get Social Security down the road. But you have to work and contribute to Social Security in order to get Social Security is how it works now. Retirement age at the time is 65. Today, it's higher because people are living a lot longer. I mean, 65 was a really old age in the 1930s. But realistically speaking, this is a New Deal era program, which, of course, now is the lifeblood of a lot of seniors in places like Florida today. So there's some other things that came out during the New Deal and Second New Deal that basically were trying to cover or fix the problems that created the Great Depression in the first place. The SEC is one of the Securities and Exchange Commission. In 1934, they come out there and they say there need to be rules about how people do things like trading on stocks and insider information. Insider trading is going to be banned. That's what Martha Stewart got caught up in a few years ago, where she got called by a friend of hers who was a leading person in a particular company and said, wow, our earnings are going to come out tomorrow and our stock price is going to tank. If you have any of our stock, you might want to dump it now before anybody else knows about it. Well, that's not allowed. Okay. And basically this set a fair system of trading rules for stocks and futures and things like that that are still in place today. The SEC is still very much involved in watching and regulating everything that happens in that particular realm today. 21st Amendment is going to come out. And a lot of people have a hard time remembering their amendments, but usually the 18th and 21st is pretty easy. If you remember the fact, what are you not allowed to do at 18? And that answer is, of course, buy alcohol. What are you allowed to do at 21? Buy alcohol. Same thing goes with the Great Depression. 18th Amendment, is going to bring in prohibition. The 21st Amendment is going to completely get rid of it. People are going to go back to having alcohol. Now, on a rather awesome note for the federal government, it also doesn't hurt that they were spending an awful lot of time going out there and trying to enforce the rules while people were trying to break the rules. But now they can tax the legal sale of alcohol and use that money to help fund operations for the federal government to a larger degree. So the 21st Amendment comes in also during the Roosevelt administration, ending good old number 18. The Fair Labor Standards Act, again, anything that goes over another state border, so from Florida to Georgia, for example, now becomes a federal issue. If it's just within Florida, it's just a Florida issue. So if you have a company that goes across more than one state border, you're now held to the Fair Labor Standards Act. The federal government's going to have rules that apply: minimum wage, maximum work week, no more than 40 hours, unless you're going to get overtime, which is your choice. And overtime, as you can see here, is time and a half. So you make $10 an hour. With overtime, once you reach 40 hours a week, you are now going to make, what's time and a half? $10 an hour, $15 an hour. By federal law. Any work by children under 16 is banned. And some of you might go, wait a second, my parents have me working in my restaurant or our family's restaurant or something else. That doesn't count. If it's a family business, they can have you work there. It's like a chore. So the Hatch Act was also going to cover something that was a problem in the era. Individuals who were in government, while they were in government, like, hey, I'm running for re-election. Now, if you want this law passed, it might be a really good idea if you give me money. You're not allowed to do that kind of thing. The president's not supposed to do that. Congressmen aren't supposed to do that. Basically, it's a pay-for-play kind of thing that, I don't have the money to go influence a congressman very much. They should be doing what's right for the people in general. And so it does say here the president's allowed to shake people down. Go figure. But Yeah, the Hatch Act was responsible for trying to keep what we would consider to be bribery out of the federal government as much as possible. So by the time you come to the end of the New Deal and let's say the beginning stages of World War II, I mean, 39 is when the war begins in Europe. It's already begun in Asia. The United States is not involved at that particular point. But the national debt, which had been going down during the 1920s, if you recall, they had budget surpluses. The debt had gone from $19.5 billion, and that's owed at the time mostly to Americans who have bought bonds or done other things. And now the debt's at $40.5 billion. The number is only going to increase during the Second World War and has got bigger and bigger ever since. Unemployment in 1939, 17.2%. Now, at the height of things, it was, close to 30%, close to 30%. But when FDR took office, it was roughly 25. At 17.2%, that's still an awful lot of people. It's basically where the United States is today. And again, today is May 11th of 2020. All the restaurant workers who are out of work and the hotel workers and the Disney people and all that other kind of stuff all across the country, and we're scared to death about what the economy could look like if things don't reopen, supposedly. We're at 17% unemployment overall. And some of that is seen as temporary because, just today, restaurants are supposed to be, operating again in a limited capacity. But, 17%, and this is considered a good thing because this is where it's been now for about 10 years or worse. So overall, the New Deal did have some successes. It did put some money in some people's pockets. It did bring down unemployment to some smaller number, but not a small number. The government was in debt, and it was going to take basically World War II to get everybody back on their feet. So with that, we're done with this one. And we'll have one more up this week. There's a quiz. There's also a reading check. And that's that for now.